You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Mozart. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
These are the headlines today, the 23rd of March. Youngest victim of latest sex grooming scandal, allegedly just 11 years old. From the belly of the beast with Nick Griffin. Thought for the day, I get poetic. UK News. 13 men have been arrested for child sex grooming in Operation Bullfinch in Oxford, but police have so far refused to say the nationalities of the men involved. Why the police are refusing to say the names or nationalities of these paedophiles is the usual method of hiding them from public anger, usually for months. Police say 24 girls were being groomed for rape by paedophiles travelling around the country. 4 of the men were released on bail until April the 19th. One BNP spokesperson commented, "If the police won't inform us of the nationalities of these men, we will find out soon enough when they appear in court in April, because we will be there." World News. The Euro report today comes live from Nick Griffin himself. Please allow for the fact it has been recorded over the phone. I give you our chairman, Nick Griffin MEP.
Anyone who thinks that the career of Mohamed Merah ended when a French sniper put a bullet through his head is terribly mistaken. For, despite the threadbare camouflage of the ritual protestations that Islam condemns terrorism and the murder of the innocent, the reality is that millions of the young Muslim colonists of Europe now have a new hero. The ghost of Osama bin Laden has been shunted aside. Despite his status as an Islamist inspiration after 9/11, he was an old man, a multimillionaire engineer turned fugitive goatherd and recluse. He spoke Arabic, so however much Europe's alienated young Muslims looked up to him, they couldn't understand a word he said, except jihad, jihad, just like portrayed in Team America. They were for him, but he was never one of them. They supported him, but they could never hope to copy him. So while thousands of them did go off to fight his jihad in Afghanistan, the vast majority in the Muslim ghettos of Bordeaux, Bradford, Berlin, Blackburn, Brussels and Birmingham admired him from as big a distance psychologically as geographically. But Mohamed Merah was one of them. His jihad, in the suburbs of a mundane French city, could just as easily be waged by them, on their own turf, in their own little bit of the Dar el-Harb, the zone of war in which, regardless of all the establishment's religion of peace claptrap, they all know they live. His mercifully brief spree, as cowardly multiple child killer and murderer of unarmed off-duty soldiers, provokes in Westerners like us nothing but revulsion. But to the Muslim teenagers who hang around our streets or play pool in taxpayer-funded youth clubs, he is a hero and a role model. Playing around in souped-up cars, into football and pretty girls, if you have to ask from which community, then you need to listen to earlier editions of The World at 8. Repeatedly in trouble with the racist, Islamophobic police, just an ordinary Western-born Muslim kid, just like them. Except that he discovered his identity. He found his purpose in life. He took spectacular revenge for the injustices inflicted on Islam and Muslims by the Crusaders and the Zionists. And he died in a painless instant, launching a suicidal assault on a small army which thought that it was supposed to be assaulting him. We see a squalid, cruel fanaticism. They see one of their own, a nowhere man like any one of them, transformed into a hero. And so, right now, a significant number of the young Muslim men you see on a street near you want nothing more than to become the next Mohamed Merah. For most of them, the aspiration will remain just that, a bit like the old song that mocked the loudmouthed advocates of revolution. As soon as this pub closes, we'll raise the barricades. But mark my words, for some of them, perhaps at present mere boys of 15 or 16, the news footage of the dramatic end of Mohamed Merah will become the beginning of the rest of their own short lives as jihadists. The only question is when these newly created time bombs of resentment and hate will go off, and how many more innocents they will take with them. The establishment fools, media knaves and cautious Muslims who try to conceal the innate radicalism and extremism of Islam will of course try to convince the public we've heard the last of Mohamed Merah. He was, they will say, a one-off, a loner, with a perverted understanding of a religion of kindness and tolerance. But of course, they're lying again. They couldn't be more wrong. Because, despite all their lies, the Quran does not condemn murder, not even the murder of innocent civilians and children. It only condemns murder when it is not justified by being in retaliation for murder or for corruption in the land. Scarcely a news broadcast goes by without some reminder of the deadly presence of crusader forces in the Muslim world. To us, the slaughter of guests at an Afghan or Pakistani wedding by a US drone missile is costly collateral damage in a futile war we want ended as soon as possible. To young Muslims watching the same footage, it's another example of how the West is killing their brothers and sisters. Add in the memory of Iraq and the endless recurring violence in Israel, and even before the Israelis or Americans start in Iran, there is more than enough murder to provide the justification they need to see killing infidels as a divinely ordained duty. Similarly, the usury, homosexuality, female equality and freedom of speech that they see every day in the West can indeed be regarded as constituting corruption in the land, for all are contrary to the word of Allah and the teachings of his Prophet. At different times throughout history, there have been strands of Islam, particularly in the Sufi tradition, which would not have held such evils could be legitimately countered by the cold-blooded murder of Jewish schoolchildren. Unfortunately, however, it is not Sufi mysticism that dominates the internet and shapes the views of the imams preaching in the mosques and madrasas that have sprung up all over Europe over the last few decades. Modern Islam is dominated by the theology of the fundamentalist Wahhabism of Saudi Arabia, and the strain we have in Britain is rendered even more virulent by its hybridization with the Deobandi sect, which holds so much sway in the near-failed state of Pakistan. However much historical illiterates like Cameron bleat on about Islam being a religion of peace, while the bulk of the funding for the spread of Islam in Europe comes from Saudi's recycled petrodollars, all we will get from Islam is war. It may be the covert war waged by Fabian-style advocates of revolution by stealth, personified by the slimy spokesman of the so-called Muslim Council of Britain, or it may be the open war fought by self-radicalized street thugs like Meira. And, thanks to the grotesque failure of the French establishment to deal with him when he first came to their attention waving a sword and shouting Allah Akbar in the streets of Toulouse, the hideous success of his one-man jihad means there is now an endless supply of young would-be imitators in the pipeline. Not all will have the courage he displayed at his end. A lot of them, when push comes to shove, won't even have the guts to go get themselves a gun. But his example will still inspire even the lesser jihadists, now incubating in our midst, to get out on the streets with bricks and petrol bombs in the street intifada that's waiting to break out, given a few weeks' hot weather and just one spark. The police will in turn bring out their newly acquired plastic bullets, tear gas and water cannons. That means that they will get the upper hand, which is the point at which Mohammed Meira will become the further inspiration for the smaller numbers who will tire of being beaten by the superior equipment of the paramilitary police and decide to move from rioting mobs to terrorist cells. Sadly, nothing can now prevent that vicious cycle of events running its course. The only question is what now lies on the other side of the coming decade of crisis. Will it be cowardly elite surrender and repression of native resentment, leading to the Islamization of Europe? That would have been the probable end result a few years ago, but now it looks far less likely. There are two reasons for this. The first is a fast-growing spirit of resistance, particularly among the new generation of European youngsters who have reached the age of political and territorial consciousness in the post-9/11 era, which means they've known nothing except Muslims behaving badly. Just like Meira and thousands of young Europe-based jihadists, a significant minority of these indigenous lads have been trained in the fight against Islam in the dusty fields and alleys of Helmand. Ironically, both sides in the future conflagration in Europe are learning their deadly trade in Afghanistan. All too soon, that war is going to come home. On top of that, one has only to scratch the surface of the increasingly influential counter-jihad movement to find that a new factor has entered the equation. Jewish intellectuals, who for decades provided a high proportion of the brainpower behind the emasculation of the West and the attempted genocide of multiculturalism, have largely done a U-turn. It's not really a matter of changing sides, for they remain as instinctively and intellectually committed to the cause of their own people as ever. And that, let me make it clear, is not something for which they should be condemned, but applauded, if only our own intellectuals were similarly ethnocentric. What has changed is their perception of where the greatest threat to their people lies. In the post-war West, it was indigenous European nationalism which haunted their imaginations. The best way of ensuring that there would never again be another Hitler was to ensure that the nations which could give rise to such a monster themselves ceased to exist. Looked at from their point of view, it was a logical enough position. The problem was that, as with the creation of the golem in the Central European Jewish folk myth, multiculturalism had created a new monster, even more dangerous than the one it was meant to protect against. But the Jewish people have not survived 2,000 years of diaspora and persecution without each successive generation producing individuals with acutely sensitive psychological antennae by which to pick up the early vibrations of the next great threat to their collective survival. So, even before Mohammed Merah, many of them had realised that the next great threat is Islam and the mass third world immigration with which it is intimately linked. All of a sudden, Western culture and Western nations are not the enemy, but the lifeboat. It was always dishonest for white supremacist anti-Semites to blame all Jews for the undoubted role of some Jewish intellectuals in the rise of communism, and in particular its culture-killing Frankfurt School mutation. It is now even more dishonest for them to refuse to acknowledge the huge and still growing role of many individual Jews in media, academic and internet efforts to build the counter-jihad movement, success of which is essential to our survival as a people. True, they still haven't got it quite right. Far too many counter-jihadists, both Jews and Gentiles, still subscribe to the neocon scheme to meddle in the Islamic world in the pursuit of oil, profit and the perceived interest of Zionism, a political ideology that is far closer to being the last surviving example of Western colonialism than the salvation. I'll read that paragraph again. True, they still haven't got it quite right. Far too many counter-jihadists, both Jews and Gentiles, still subscribe to the neocon scheme to meddle in the Islamic world in the pursuit of oil, profit and the perceived interest of Zionism, a political ideology that is far closer to being the last surviving example of Western colonialism than the salvation of the Jewish people. Zionist adventures, such as the building of illegal settlements on stolen Palestinian land, do not make the world safe for ordinary Jews, as those poor little kids found out in Toulouse earlier this week. Rather, they contribute to the one-sided outrage felt by fanatics like Mohammed Merah. The only way out of that vicious cycle of hatred is a sustained policy of disengagement. The West must stop meddling in the Islamic world and must end the addiction to oil that is financing our destruction. And we need to recognise that once an experiment keeps ending in disaster, only madmen keep repeating it over and over again. So we need to stop and reverse the tide of immigration and the creeping Islamisation of our continent. That can only come about through open, honest debate. And that debate will come much quicker and stands a much better chance of reaching the correct, properly informed conclusion thanks to the counter-jihad movement. The salvation of the West and of the indigenous Christian and Jewish diaspora identities, which have no other safe home, cannot be done on the cheap. It cannot be done easily, but it will be a lot cheaper and very much easier than the alternative, which doesn't bear thinking about, even though we all know what it would be. Anyone who didn't before only has to remember the victims of Mohammed Merah, for in such remembrance is the beginning of understanding and the determination that the nightmare will be ended for good.
Thought for the day. A poem in memory of all fallen heroes by Rudyard Kipling. The foreword is actually an editor's introduction on a book by J.E. Purnell titled There Will Be War. The poem is called The Widows Party. The widow in this poem is of course Victoria Regina, Queen of England and Empress of India. The Widows Party by Rudyard Kipling. Where have you been this while away, Johnny, Johnny? Out with the rest on a picnic lay, Johnny, my Johnny, aha. They called us out from the barrack yard, to God knows where from Gosport hard, and you can't refuse when you get the card, and the widow gives the party. What did you get to eat and drink, Johnny, Johnny? Standing water as thick as ink, Johnny, my Johnny, aha. A bit of beef there were 3 years stored, a bit of mutton as tough as a board, and a fowl we killed with the sergeant's sword, when the widow gives the party. What did you do for knives and forks, Johnny, Johnny? We carried 'em with us wherever we walks, Johnny, my Johnny, aha. And some was sliced and some was halved, and some was crimped and some was carved, and some was gutted and some was starved, when the widow gives the party. What are you done with half your mess, Johnny, Johnny? They couldn't do more and they couldn't do less, Johnny, my Johnny, aha. They ate their whack and they drank their fill, and I think the rations that made them ill, for half my company's lying still, where the widow give the party. What was the end all of the show, Johnny, Johnny? Ask my colonel, for I don't know, Johnny, my Johnny, aha. We broke a king and we built a road, a courthouse stands where the regiment goed, and the river's clean where the raw blood flowed, when the widow gives a party. You have been listening to The World at 8. I am Lynn Mozar, and I and the team at Radio Britain wish you all a very happy and a very safe weekend. 4 girls were being groomed for rape by paedophiles travelling around the country. 4 of the men were released on bail until April the 19th. One BNP spokesperson commented, If the police won't inform us of the nationalities of these men, we will find out soon enough when they appear in court in April, because we will be there. Been arrested for child sex grooming in Operation Bullfinch in Oxford, but police have so far refused to say the nationalities of the men involved. Why the police are refusing to say the names or nationalities of these paedophiles is the usual method of hiding them from public anger, usually for months. Police say
You're listening to The World at 8 with Lynn Moser. The World at 8, the number one in nationalist news.
These are the headlines today, the 23rd of March. Youngest victim of latest sex grooming scandal, allegedly just 11 years old. From the belly of the beast with Nick Griffin. Thought for the day, I get poetic. UK News. 13 men have... World News. The Euro report today comes live from Nick Griffin himself. Please allow for the fact it has been recorded over the phone. I give you our chairman, Nick Griffin MEP.
Anyone who thinks that the career of